It's a direct consequence of Israel's own policies of instead of encouraging this evolution of Hamas away from, armed conflict to engagement in the political process. They could have encouraged that shift, just like the PLO before it. The PLO had been recognized as a terrorist organization, but Arafat became recognized as a legitimate partner for peace, renouncing terrorism, accepting the two-state solution. And that was the threat. That was the threat from Hamas, that Hamas was going to become more moderate, just like the PLO before it had, and accept the two-state solution and become a peace partner. And that was the last thing that Israel wanted, was for Hamas to become a peace partner. So Israel did everything in its power through its policies to ensure that Hamas remained a radical terrorist organization.
Well, what about the argument that yes, they had elections and Hamas came to power, but there hasn't been elections since, and so
Yeah.
how is Palestine?
Well, yeah, Abbas's term ended in 2009, so he's not a legitimate leader. The Palestinians really have no legitimate leadership. But again, this is a direct consequence of U.S. and Israeli policies, where they won't allow elections, essentially, because Hamas would participate. And they can't allow Hamas to participate in elections like they did in 2004, 2005, and 2006.
Was that an embarrassment, or was that because I could see both sides from Israel's standpoint, like like we've talked about Israel wanting Hamas to be propped up because then they don't have a legitimate partner, but at the same time, they could be embarrassed by the fact that, wow, look, here's Hamas as the now a potential legitimate government in Palestine.
Yeah, Israel did not want to see Hamas elected to power. And so it was trying to undermine the elections. It wouldn't allow Hamas candidates run in occupied East Jerusalem, for example. And so the U.S. funded, in violation of Palestinian law, election law, funded Fatah against Hamas. So the U.S. and Israel were trying to undermine the elections. They were interfering in the elections to try to undermine Hamas and to prevent Hamas from gaining political power through democratic elections.
They just wanted Hamas to be this fringe group that they could always use to keep from the peace process from continuing.
Precisely. Okay. Right. And so this is what I mean when I say that Hamas is its existence is a consequence of Israel's policies, and its continued extremist nature, its terrorist nature, is a consequence of Israel's policies and the U.S.'s policies. And so it's just not the case that the Palestinians are incapable of reasoning. This is what we're supposed to believe. They have, the Palestinian leadership, again, has offered incredible concessions historically. And if you want to know who the true rejectionists are, as I pointed out in the debate, it's a matter of public record. Every year in the General Assembly, there are two resolutions that are put up to a vote. One is it's titled something like a peaceful resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, something like that. Where it's just a reiteration of the two-state solution. And it kind of details what the elements of the two-state solution are, including an end to the occupation and a just resolution to the refugee problem. And the other resolution is a very short resolution. It's just simply titled the Palestinian, the right of Palestinians to self-determination. And that's all the resolution does. It simply reaffirms that the Palestinians have a right to self-determination. That's it. It's a very short, simple resolution. Every year on both of those resolutions, the U.S. joins Israel and a handful of Pacific states like Palau and Marshall Islands, essentially U.S. client states, a handful, defy the world in voting no to both of those resolutions. So who are the rejectionists? It's Israel and the U.S. And the entire U.S.-led so-called peace process has always been the means by which Israel and its superpower benefactor blocked implementation of the two-state solution, because there's a deception about the peace process. We're supposed to believe that the U.S. declares and Israel declares that they accepted Resolution 242 as the basis for peace negotiations. But that's a big deception, because Resolution 242 called on Israel to withdraw from the occupied territories in accordance with the principle of international law that the acquisition of territory by war is inadmissible. And the Security Council's intent, explicitly stated intent, you can go back to the UN meeting records, the explicit intent of the Security Council was that Israel must fully and immediately withdraw to the armistice lines, the pre-June 5th, 1967 lines. But Israel has its own unilateral interpretation of 242. So under Israel's unilateral interpretation, which has no validity under international law, under its alternative interpretation, the Palestinians must negotiate with their oppressors, with the occupying power, over how much of their own land they can keep and maybe someday exercise some kind of limited autonomy over, while Israel continues to prejudice the outcome of those negotiations with its persistent, continued illegal settlement regime in the occupied territories, which is completely incompatible with principles of international law. But that is the framework that the U.S. adopted as the basis, the foundation for the peace process. So the two-state solution is distinct from a two-state solution that you hear U.S. and Israeli officials talk about. They're two completely different things. The two-state solution, in favor of which there is an virtual international consensus, and has been since the early 70s, the two-state solution is premised on the applicability of international law to the conflict, whereas the entire US-led so-called peace process was premised on a rejection of the applicability of international law to the conflict. And this prejudice is observable in Western media reporting when they say things like, oh, Israel has offered concessions. Israel has offered to cede land. Well, none of the land is Israel's to cede. And all of the generous offer was Israel demanding the Palestinians to cede Palestinian land to Israel. So this was the entire nature of the peace process. It was the means by which essentially the U.S. helped Israel to block implementation of the two-state solution and implementation of Resolution 242. So the U.S. policy essentially prolonged the occupation, supported the occupation, supported the settlement regime as well, despite rhetoric, where U.S. officials sometimes have, in the title of my book, Obstacle to Peace, is taken in part from this, where they have, U.S. officials sometimes describe the settlements as an obstacle to peace. Alternatively, that phrase has been used to describe the Palestinian leadership, Arafat being an obstacle to peace, for example.
Right.
So I'm borrowing the title of my book from those two applications of the term. So you hear this phrase used to describe the settlement sometimes, but actions are more important than words when determining what is the policy. And you can just look at the U.S. record in the Security Council of protecting Israel against international censure for its ongoing settlement regime, for its ongoing occupation regime, for its essential apartheid regime.
I want to ask you about the settlement regime because it's a little bit fuzzy in my mind from a standpoint of, I think, similar to the original Zionist plan to purchase land and to to settle in that way. Is that what's happening?